So this has happened over the course of the last month. So, September has ended, and as we can see, it deserves the name Month of the Protests. But what caused this cascade effect of protests? What are the demands, and what do they even have in common? While the underlying grievances were there the entire time, we can look at the giant protests happening in Indonesia at the end of August as a clear trigger that inspired other countries to do the same. First, let's look at the motive for each protest so we can then piece together a common motive. In Indonesia, the motive was very clearly political corruption. We actually made a video about it a few weeks ago. It was all triggered when members of the parliament donated to themselves a $3,000 housing allowance on top of their salaries, which are about 5 to 10 times higher than the country's minimum wage. Other grievances included state violence and overall very visible class disparities between the capitalist class and the poor working class. The protests have since then died down, but the impact they had on other countries are beyond comprehension. Moving from Indonesia right next door to the Philippines, we see a very similar story. A corruption scandal angered the entire nation when it was discovered that the House of Representatives passed flood control projects that are believed to have cost billions of dollars. A very clear case of money funneling by overpricing infrastructure projects to then compensate for huge kickbacks and then give it to congressmen and senators. Upon this discovery, tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets of Manila, the capital of the Philippines, where they were met with batons and police repression. Fuel was very much added to the fire after two very wealthy individuals, Sara and Pacifico Dizcaya, one of the richest capitalists in the Philippines that owns several construction companies, won flood control contracts that showed dozens of European and US luxury cars and SUVs. One of the protesters said that, "I feel bad that we wallow in poverty and we lose our homes, our lives and our future, while they rake in big fortune from our taxes that pay for their luxury cars, foreign trips, and bigger corporate transactions." According to the Department of Finance, the Philippine economy is estimated to have lost up to 118.5 billion pesos, which is about $2 billion from 2023 to 2025 due to corruption in flood control projects. Massive protests began in Nepal after one of the provincial minister's social media posts went viral, where he has shown obscene displays of wealth and luxury items. While the protests were quite moderate at first, what triggered the turning point was the government's decision to ban social media as a result of this unrest. This only made people more angry, and due to already mass social discontent and wealth disparities, Nepal saw historic and revolutionary change happen overnight. The protesters were angry that working-class young people are struggling to meet basic everyday needs, while the billionaires are drowning in luxury. The protests made three demands: end corruption, end nepotism, and reform the country's political systems. For now, key government officials, including the Prime Minister, have resigned following the protests. Oh, also the parliament was literally burned down. We will keep you updated on anything new that happens in the country. For now, this is all. Now we're getting much closer to current day events with Madagascar. This time directly inspired by the protests in Indonesia and Nepal, the so-called Gen Z protests in Madagascar started about a week ago over routine water and power cuts by the island government. This, while severe, is not the only grievance that the population has. According to the World Bank, some 75% of the country's 30 million population lived below the poverty line in 2022. This discontent hasn't gone any better under Jan's Raswelna's administration. While the protests in Madagascar did not have a single trigger like the other countries, we can see how mass protests on one side of the hemisphere, like Nepal, can trigger a cascade effect that moves change elsewhere. Since the protests have now turned into hundreds of thousands on the street, with neither a curfew slowing it down, the president Raswelna has since dissolved the government, but the protesters still demand more than that. They demand accountability for the president as well. They want him to step down. The protests are still ongoing in this moment that we're recording, so we'll have to see where this goes. But at this point, at least 22 people have been killed and 100 people have been injured by the police. Protests in Peru have intensified these past few weeks after the legislator passed a law forcing young adults into private pension funds, a decision that many see as an attack on the working class already trapped in unstable employment. Youth collectives, including Generation Z, once again, organized marches towards the presidential palace in downtown Lima. Peru's wave of protests is deeply tied to its turbulent political history, especially in the last few years. Ever since the political coup against semi-leftist President Castillo in 2022, carried out by conservative Dina Boluarte, tensions between the rural poor, the working class, indigenous communities, and the wealthy capitalists have continued to rise. This is nothing new. During the 1990s, the authoritarian government of Alberto Fujimori used fear and repression to further marginalize indigenous and peasant communities. Dina Boluarte's approval ratings, already in free fall after announcing she will undemocratically stay in power until 2023, have sunk even further as her administration fails to contain the crisis. However, the protests are not just limited to Boluarte's government. Over the past 6 months, Peru has seen rising violence linked to extortion and organized crime. Further fueling unrest and sharpening the sense that the government only governs for the wealthy, while abandoning the working class and indigenous majority. Argentina is experiencing mass protests following a brutal crime that horrified the entire country. A suspected drug gang livestreamed on Instagram the torture and killing of 2 women and a 15-year-old girl, an act of premeditated murder meant to punish the victims for allegedly violating gang code. Lured into a van on September 19th under the pretense of going to a party, the 3 young women instead became victims of a gruesome display of narco-violence. The shocking crime has pushed people to the streets nationwide to demand justice for the victims and accountability for a state seen as basically apathetic in the face of rising narco-violence. The protesters denounced the inaction of right-wing libertarian President Javier Milei's administration, accusing it of turning a blind eye to the spread of organized crime. While the government was not directly responsible for the murders, millions of people rightfully see openly misogynistic Javier Milei as an enabler of what many groups call a femicide. This especially after his government dismantled many women aid institutions such as the Ministry of Women, Genders and Diversity and the National Anti-Discrimination Institute, and is dismantling programs such as Acompañar, a financial aid for survivors of gender violence. When the presidency itself spreads misogynistic and anti-feminist rhetoric, it disinhibits violence from below, turning narco-brutality and gender-based killings into symptoms of a society where the state itself has actively legitimized their oppression. Morocco is the latest in line of mass youth-led protests. Organized on social media by a group called Gen Z 212, the protests began at the very end of September over government austerity cuts to public services in healthcare and education. Described as some of the biggest protests in recent Moroccan history, it quickly spread to over 11 Moroccan cities and 200 protesters have already been arrested. While mainly focusing on public services, popular discontent with growing wealth inequality and unemployment cannot be ignored. Morocco's unemployment rate currently stands at 12.8%, with youth unemployment reaching 35.8%, 19% being graduates. So, how do we interpret all of this? What do the protests in Indonesia, Philippines, Nepal, Peru, Madagascar, Argentina, Morocco all have in common? You probably noticed Gen Z being repeated again and again and again. This is no coincidence, and it's not centralized by some supreme Gen Z leader either. These groups are completely grassroots, organized on social media, led by young people, and consistently displaying the One Piece flag. But why? There is no denying that in recent years, there is a consistent divide between younger and older generations in politics. We see this during elections, support for Palestine, but also views on wealth redistribution and the big scary socialism word, which is favored amongst the younger generations. The reasons for this are many, but the biggest reason I believe is simply that right-wing neoliberal politics are currently screwing us over. Our generation, wherever neoliberal capitalism exists, is getting priced out of the housing market, priced out of healthcare and mental health services, is getting constantly told to study for university, but then we still end up working a minimum wage job with no social mobility. Our generation is currently bearing witness to the lie of capitalism and its promise of meritocracy. And that is not even mentioning the climate crisis, which, while we're told to get a job and have a family, is actively making that future impossible. This current generation is the most radicalized from the status quo. Unfortunately, here in the West at least, we often see this radicalism being swayed by the far right. It is therefore our job to show that the true perpetrators of our misery is not the migrant, it is not the Jew, it is not the transsexual, but it is the wealthy capitalist elite and its corrupt political puppets.